All right, folks, welcome to Chai Hack Night. I'm one of your co-hosts, Derek Eater. I'm happy to introduce, for his first time co-hosting ever, Sean. You want to say hi, Sean?
Hey y'all, I'm Sean. I'm going to be co-hosting this evening for the first time, so I hope it goes well.
I think it will. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us on this frigid Chicago Tuesday night. This is December 8th. This is actually our second to last Chai Hack Night of the year. Super excited to have tonight's presenter, Marshini Chetty, from the University of Chicago, and she's going to be talking about kids' privacy and security during online learning. So that's something that I think a lot of people are potentially very interested in. I know I am as a parent of a first grader, so I'm looking forward to that. Before we get to that, though, a couple of things we always like to go through. You can see here's the agenda. We'll have a couple of announcements that we're going to be sharing with everybody. After that, the presentation will start, like I said, in about 7:10. Then we'll have a time for Q&A, questions for the presenter. And then after that, this live stream will end, but then we'll move on to a post live stream Zoom call that anyone can join. And then we'll have breakout groups after that. John, you want to talk a little bit about how Q&A would work?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. The best way to submit questions actually on the YouTube live chat. Just should be to the right of your screen. And then we'll read them in and we'll ask and then hopefully get answers. But as a friendly reminder, our code of conduct will be strictly enforced, and we ask that you respect and consider that while you're posting your questions. And I think that's it. And now we can kick off some announcements.
Yeah, let's do it. You want to take the first one?
Sure. There we go. Oh yeah. So let's talk about joining the Chai Hack Night Slack channel. If you haven't joined Slack before, it's really easy. And if you want to join the Chai Hack Night one for the first time, you can go to that link right there. That's kind of where we post different information about our breakout groups, announcements for next presentations, and a bunch of other helpful stuff about civic tech. Like if you're looking for a job, there's information about that. A bunch of really useful things. So check it out.
Like I said, this is our second to last Chai Hack Night of the year. We do have one more next Tuesday. Northside Housing and Supportive Services are going to be presenting. Then we do take 2 weeks off at the end of the year, just like we do every year, but we'll be back on January 5th. And boy, this sounds weird to say, 2021, we'll be back. So keep an eye on that.
And become a Chai Hack Night member. If you don't believe me, believe all these wonderfully colored GIFs that are littering the screen. It's great. Very much reminds me of the 90s and like kid pics and stuff.
I think
anyway,
that's what we're going for.
Yeah. So Chai Hack Night is a membership-based nonprofit. And so there are a bunch of different ways to get involved or to become a member. You can find more information about how to become a member at the URL at the bottom. And attending meetings like this is a requirement of membership, but there's a bunch of other different ways. Volunteering, like what I'm doing right now, is another way to become a member. Benefits of membership include you can run for office. If that's something you're interested in, you can vote on any changes for the bylaws, and then make decisions about Chai Hack Night in general. So consider becoming a member.
Cool. This is the Chai Hack Night Tech and Data Help Desk. This is something we set up about 6 months ago. Basically, it's a place for if you need help getting unstuck with a data problem, or you want a little bit of help analyzing or collecting some data, or you want to ask questions even about like what app should I use or should I build this app. This is meant to be kind of a clearinghouse for those kinds of questions. So if you have a question that you want some help with, you can go to this URL, the bit.ly/CHN help desk, and fill out the form, and someone will get back to you within a day or so. And also on the other side, if you want to be one of the many volunteers, I think we have about 40 that have signed up to respond to these tickets, and we have quite a range of skills that people have. If you want to join and be part of the group of people who are answering these tickets, you can fill out the other form, which is CHN help desk volunteer down at the bottom. Oh, you know what? I can do this one too since I added it.
Sounds good.
There's a really awesome tech journalist, Zainab Tufekci. She wrote a number of books, but maybe one more well-known is Twitter and Tear Gas. Anyway, she has this blog, and I thought it was a really great example of the power of open data. It's actually the story of the Chinese scientists that actually decoded and uploaded and made completely free and open the genome for the coronavirus. And they did it back, literally this is a picture of the tweet, January 11th, 2020. So like super early days, and they just did it. And they actually got some backlash for releasing the information because it was still early days and there was a lot of denial going on. And so this is a really great story that Cybernaut tells about just the power of and the value of openness, right? Especially in the scientific community. So definitely something worth checking out. You can find the link. It's the long one at the bottom, but you can just look for cybernaut.substack.com. You can read the blog there. And this is, I don't know, have you tried this one yet, Sean? It's
yeah, I actually did. It's really cool. Here, I can talk about it a little bit. So it's this is from the New York Times, as you can see. It kind of gives you a little in-depth. There's few questions. They're really simple questions at the top that you answer, just a little bit about yourself. And it kind of gives you an idea of where you are in line to get a coronavirus vaccine. It's from the New York Times. It's just a neat little tool. So I'd consider checking it out.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to know because you're not going to get one soon. Is generally the answer. I filled in my info, and I think I'm 260 millionth in line in the US. So like, I think a lot of people are expecting, oh, it's going to be approved next week potentially, or this week even. There's a lot of people who should get it first. And so that's just something I want people to know about. And this is a really helpful tool to explain that.
And then finally, just a reminder that after this presentation, we'll have the Zoom call, that's where we have our 3-word intros, talk more about announcements and breakout groups. And that'll start just shortly after the presentation at 8 p.m. There'll be a link posted in the Slack channel. So if you join Slack or if you look there tonight, there'll be a link to the Zoom in the Slack channel that you can click on. But it's also right there if you are able to remember it.
Yeah, we'll also post it in the live chat as well, so you can go there too. Cool. I think that's it for us. It's time for our feature presenter. Marshini, are you there?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Sean and I will fade into the background and leave it all to you. So take it away.
Okay. So let me share my screen. And let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Right. Okay. Awesome. So thank you so much, Derek and Sean, for having me tonight at Chai Hack Night. And I'm coming to you again from the University of Chicago. And one of my collaborators is also here. I'll tell you a bit more about her in a second. So I wanted to just talk about this new normal that we're in. Okay, so I've come here to talk to you about kids' privacy and security during online learning, but really I'm just talking to you about how are kids learning in this new normal. They're having to deal with things like Zoom bombing, when people take over something like a Zoom call like this and do nasty things. They have to worry about things like, are students talking to each other? Should they be allowed to talk to the teacher and text chat? What about etiquette? Like now you're seeing into my home, you can see what's behind me. For school children, do they have to think about virtual backgrounds? Should they think about what their name is on Zoom, or even how they're going to take turns? And then obviously, just like this is being recorded, school kids now have to think about, is what I'm saying being recorded, right? And so this is kind of the new normal that we're facing right now during the pandemic. Hopefully, if you're in line for the vaccines and you find out you're actually in line, there'll be a change sometime, but we don't know how long this is going to be. And really, this creates a lot of issues. So one issue that's very local to Chicago, about a month ago, Chicago Public Schools found out that they had this bug where one of the systems they were using called Go Guardian, which is a really helpful system that allows teachers to remotely control websites on a student's desktop and things like that, was actually a bit problematic. So essentially what could happen was they found a bug where teachers could go on remote machines and start a Google Meet, so a video live stream into a student's home, even if they didn't agree to that, right? They didn't think that anyone actually exploited this, but this just kind of highlights some of the privacy issues that happen when we suddenly have a window into someone else's home and when we're thinking about school children and teachers. Coupled with that, in the same news story in the Chicago Sun-Times, one of the parents was also saying, in addition to just using Zoom and GoGuardian and all these other kinds of apps, with the pandemic, there are just so many more apps. And even pre-pandemic, a lot of educational technologies are being used in classrooms. And often as parents, it's hard to keep track of what these are. It's hard to keep track of what data is being used and where is the data being stored and so on. And even for teachers, this is hard. So here's a story from Utah. This is from the Salt Lake Tribune, also very recent, last month, where basically a teacher is talking about a student where the student's mom was working 12-hour days, but the student just wasn't logging on, right? So for teachers, it's really hard because they need to be able to see if students are actually engaged. Are they actually showing up, right? So you have all these privacy and security issues, but also you have to have some meaning or some way for teachers to actually check up on students. So I started thinking about this problem a long time ago, kind of around, I think, 2016. And what I sort of found was that there are not a lot of resources to help kids learn about online privacy and security, even pre-pandemic or now. And most of the resources are kind of geared towards fourth graders and above, right? Because older kids are online, they might have social media platforms, they're talking to other people. And so a lot of the resources are geared towards kids of that age. But when you're thinking about 5-year-olds in elementary school and above, so 5 to 11-year-olds in elementary school, there's not that much geared towards them. And this is surprising because kids are basically being born with iPads in their hands, right? And what I think this is kind of like is saying, how about we teach kids to learn how to swim and throw them into a shark-infested pool? So kind of like when they're already on social media and they're already using the internet a lot, let's teach them about privacy and security. And I think that that's too late because kids are online all the time. And now, kids that I know that are 5 years old know more about Zoom than I do because of the pandemic. What our approach is in our project is to actually help kids learn about privacy and security from a younger age, from kindergarten. So this is kind of like teaching them how to swim when the pool is fairly clean. There are no sharks in there yet, and you're trying to just get them comfortable with the water. And so essentially our project, which we call Connecting Context, is geared at helping elementary school age kids manage online privacy and security and learn about these concepts. And we're starting at this young age because, like I said, it's important for kids to learn about these concepts, not just when it's too late and when they're less likely to listen to you anyways. So our team's been working together since 2016. And we've published a bunch of research papers on this. So we've interviewed kids aged 5 to 11 to ask them about what they understand about privacy and security pre-pandemic. We've looked at teachers and spoken to teachers primarily in Maryland and New York states and tried to understand, what are their needs for helping kids learn about these subjects. And then we've also spoken to parents and asked them, how are they managing privacy and security for their kids and how are they helping their kids learn about these concepts. Right now, for our project, we're partnered with 2 schools. So Murray Language Academy, which is in Hyde Park in Chicago, and then Montpelier Elementary School, which is in Prince George's County School District in Maryland. And basically what we're trying to do is we want to understand what resources will help kids learn about this. We want to learn about kids, what are they actually learning in classrooms right now, and then also help develop resources that are geared towards parents and teachers. And so this is a 3-year project that we've started, which I'll tell you a bit more about. And we plan to work with 3 to 6 teachers at each school and with the parents-teacher associations, as well as with the teachers to do professional development to try to get this underway. So why are we doing this? Because we want to have impact. We think this is an important issue. We thought it was important before the pandemic. We think it's exacerbated now. And we really want to have impact, not just at our partner schools, but at other schools around the country. And so we plan to publish the research just like we have been doing and making these resources publicly available. So the kinds of things that I think kids should be learning about, I'll just give you a quick summary, but we think they need to know, what is the internet? What does privacy mean? What does security mean? And how do you be a good digital citizen? So we've kind of mapped out this plan. You don't have to take much away from this, aside from the fact that in kindergarten, this might look very different than if you're teaching, say, a 5th grader. So for in kindergarten, if you're trying to get a kindergartner to understand about what privacy means, you might start with simple concepts like privacy is going to the bathroom with the door closed. And then you might build up later on to talk about privacy on the internet. And this can cover the things that we were talking about even now during the pandemic, like Zoom bombing, Zoom backgrounds, names, tone taking, etiquettes, and even recording. And so this is kind of what we're geared at with our project right now. So let me tell you a bit more about our team. Like, who are we? Is it just me? Actually, it's not. So one of my colleagues I mentioned, Prof. Tammy Clegg, is here. She's at the University of Maryland in College Park. And she works in educational technology, human-computer interaction, and does a lot of participatory design with kids. So Tammy is basically our go-to person for learning how to design technologies for kids with kids, which is actually much harder than it sounds. Our other colleague, Jessica Vitak, who wasn't able to come today, is also at the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland in College Park. And she works a lot on digital privacy issues and has done a lot of work, particularly with teens, to try to help teens and understand teens' management of online privacy and security. And she's also worked a lot with adults on this topic. So now that I've sort of told you a bit more about what are we trying to do, let me tell you a bit more about what we've learned so far. So what have we actually learned about kids' privacy and security, and what can we sort of then jump to and conclude about what's happening right now with online learning? So let me first tell you about what we learned from the kids that we spoke to in all our studies up to now. The first thing we found is, even with Tammy's help to design with kids, for kids, it's very difficult, right? So if you've heard of the game Doodle Jump, one of the design activities we did with 7 to 11-year-olds in Maryland was to come up with a concept of a game that we thought we could help, help them learn about privacy and security. So we said, what if there was a privacy doodle jump? And we created these mock-ups and said, okay, maybe if this little character falls off a platform, the kids get a quiz question that could ask them questions like, what if you see an advertisement while you're playing Xbox or something like this? And we envisioned that, kids would receive positive feedback about, if they got the correct answer, or some helpful feedback if they didn't choose a correct answer, and that this would help them learn. And we actually evaluated it with the kids that we designed with. And this is what one of the 11-year-olds said, I hate it when they take a perfectly good game and they try to make it educational. Right? So I hope that this kind of summarizes a lot of the difficulties and challenges of trying to actually help kids learn about this topic. Right? We learned a lot of things when we did this design activity. For example, in this design that we were trying, kids said, this wasn't related to privacy and security enough. Like in Doodle Jump, the privacy and security themes were not integrated into the game. And also they said that these scenarios weren't very realistic. They couldn't really relate to them. So we also tried and helped them play games made by Google that were very engaging, but for them, although they were engaging, they were really abstract, and privacy and security just didn't feel like something they could relate to. So we actually, we took that feedback to heart. We developed a more fully functional mobile app called Cybernaut, where we tried to take this feedback into, consideration. And we also evaluated this with kids. And it was, again, somewhat successful, but also, probably just not the right format to teach kids about this, but this should give you an idea of the kinds of resources that we're trying to develop. So the first lesson that we learned from all of this design activities is that do's and don'ts are not affected for kids. I mean, if you're a parent, you know that telling a kid of, like age 5 not to do something is kind of like almost telling them to do it, right? And it's the same with privacy and security. If a child just has a list of, it's okay to do this, but not this, it's very hard for them to understand why they should follow that rule. They really need to know why. So why shouldn't I give someone my password? Is it because someone else will get my data? And that's much easier for them to understand how to follow the rule than if you just say, don't do this. The other thing that I mentioned before is that, so we were working with kids in Maryland, and so it was very important for them to have relatable scenarios. So if we're talking about Chicago or whatever state you're in right now, if you're a teacher, you really need to come up with scenarios that are applicable to the children in your class. Maybe take examples from the neighborhood, or even examples of the kind of privacy and security issues that are coming up in the pandemic that you can actually help use as learning moments, or, that's our spin on teachable moments. And then the final thing was that kids, they kind of need a toolbox of strategies. It's not just do's and don'ts. So many schools make you sign a contract about, here's what's acceptable on a school device, for example, that you may have received so kids can continue learning during the pandemic. But we really think they need a toolbox of strategies. And some example strategies might be as simple as, okay, I've seen, I searched for something and it's, some really bad stuff has come up. What do I do? And it could be ask a grown-up, ask a mom, ask your dad, and see if you can get help that way. And so that way, it gives kids a lot more agency over what they're doing, and it helps them deal with a lot of different privacy and security scenarios. Even as adults, we struggle with this. And so it's the same with kids. They need sort of an arsenal of strategies that they can use if they come and encounter different privacy and security scenarios. So what is it, what do we learn about parents? So parents, kind of that example I gave you of, let's wait until kids are older and then we'll teach them about privacy and security online. Pre-pandemic and even now, a lot of the parents that we spoke to said, oh yeah, my kids are not on social media now. They're only 5, 6, 7, 8, when they get there, then I'll teach them about this. And as I mentioned, that's sort of almost too late, because when kids are younger, they can sort of build some foundational knowledge so that when they're older, they're more, they have more in their arsenal, basically, and they're used to these concepts. It's not just coming out of nowhere. Also, many parents, just like teachers and even kids, they're unsure of online privacy and security challenges themselves. I mentioned I now know 5-year-olds that know more about Zoom than I do. Am I qualified to teach a 5-year-old about Zoom? And many other parents in our studies felt that way. And then parents often depended on this homeschool partnership. So right now, when we have a merging of home and school in the same place, parents are even more dependent on teachers and often thought that teachers were the ones that are teaching kids about privacy and security online. So finally, I'll tell you a bit about what we learned about teachers. So teachers right now are slammed with the pandemic, right? Whether they're in a hybrid situation, in person or online learning, they have little time to integrate more into their curricula, which are already jam-packed. And we found that with online privacy and security, it was very rare that kids were having lessons at school pre-pandemic, and it's probably still the case now, although this is something that we're researching right now. So when people that we spoke to who were teachers told us about how they're using technology in the classroom, they mentioned some of the systems that I told you about in that first Chicago Public Schools example. So they were often talking about systems like Land School or Go Guardian. In these screenshots, every little box on this screen or every little line in the Go Guardian screenshot below is essentially showing you one student's computer and everything that they're doing on that computer. So often teachers were using technologies to help facilitate activities, or they were using it to help make sure that students were staying on task. And as I mentioned, in Chicago Public Schools, it's really useful to know if someone is actually engaging. Are they actually logging on? But really, were teachers actually considering privacy and security? And they were hoping that if the school had resources to have media literacy specialists, those are the ones taking care of it. Otherwise, this was not something they were discussing, particularly in elementary school. Also, teachers had to deal with different rules at home and at school. So right now we have home and school in the same place, so that makes it very difficult. Sometimes teachers were talking about how it was very constrained in terms of what kids could access on the internet at school, but then at home they had different rules. And now we have a lot of a mismatch because home and school are in the same place. But this is still an issue when you're trying to teach about privacy and security. And then finally, what I found was really interesting was that when we were speaking to a lot of teachers, especially in the elementary school age, teachers was telling us how whenever they had a new app or a new system, they had to write down the password, like username and password for kids, because kids at that early developmental age, they have trouble typing, they have trouble remembering complex passwords. And so these little cards, which now might be sent over email and things like that, are really helpful for kids to log into all these different systems they have to use for online learning, and even pre-pandemic. But now, if you're into privacy and security like me, you'll know that this is very interesting now, right? Kids are encountering privacy and security via passwords. But then a few years later, when they get older, we say, never write down your password. Do not write down your password. Don't put it on a card, and so on. So sometimes kids are learning these poor security hygiene habits, and then we're telling them later on that they have to learn something different, right? So teachers have to deal with developmental issues. They have to deal with kids learning these habits, and then later on in middle school and above, we have to say, no, always create a new password, never use identifiable information, and never write it down. So that's kind of what we found out from some of our studies. I also just wanted to give you an idea of, are there actually any regulations that protect kids' privacy and security online? And does that apply to online learning now? So the main one or regulation that you need to know about is there's one called the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or this is affectionately known as FERPA. So this was a law that was enacted in the 70s, and basically it protects student data. So if a school is funded by the US Department of Education, then FERPA protects the kinds of records that can be accessed or sort of disclosed about that student. And so this typically is when there's private or personally identifiable information about a student. It might include grades and things like that. And usually it's only the parents or the school that can access some of these data and the student themselves up to a certain age. But often this doesn't really speak about educational technologies. So for example, if your school is using something like some sort of app and things like that, FERPA doesn't really specify how much of that is protected under this regulation. In addition to that, many states have other rules that also protect student records. So in Illinois, we have the Illinois School Students Records Act, which also protects students' records. Probably the most advanced state is California right now. They just put in the California Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and that also has a lot of protections for kids as well. But Illinois is moving in that direction. Some other states are sort of a little further behind. You can actually go to a site called, I think, Student Privacy Grades, or I forget the exact website name. I can always refer you to it if you reach out to me. But they actually show all the regulations for student privacy around the US. And then finally, there's another rule called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is COPPA. And this basically protects children under the age of 13. So kind of like the kids that we're studying, it prevents certain companies from collecting data on kids and trying to advertise to them or collecting personally identifiable information without parental consent. So COPPA is typically, protecting kids on things like YouTube, Gmail, apps that you might be downloading and so on. But even with all of these regulations in place, you might be wondering, well, what about now during the pandemic? Are student video recordings, is that protected? Does that have personally identifiable information? Well, I think now, according to the US Department of Education, it does, because if you're recording a video in an online session, then you might be recording a student's face, their voice, and that is personally identifiable information. So you can look up this on the US Department of Education site. For specific apps, though, like I mentioned, the rules are not quite clear around many educational technologies. And also, if you were very interested, you could look at the privacy policies of these apps to try to see what data is being collected and where it's stored. And this is also something that you might want to talk to people at your school about if you're a parent. Or if you're a teacher, you could also look at the privacy policies yourself. So finally, I wanted to just end off before we go to Q&A with talking about, how do we actually maintain kids' privacy and security in the pandemic? So as I mentioned, we're talking about remote schooling. You might be asking questions like, where will my child be in the home? Is it a private space? Are other people going to be going in there? Do I even have that in my home, right? People are struggling with how do I create a good learning environment, particularly if there are multiple people in the home, if there's not a good space, if the device isn't as good as you would want. And you have to think about, how do I protect my privacy? Teachers now have a window into my home. What do I think about virtual backgrounds and renaming? If you're a teacher, you might consider, does everyone have to be required to put on their video? What if they're living in a household, where people really want their privacy? For example, if they're people who, are undocumented and so on, do they really want to be able to turn on their video? And so we have to really think about these kinds of things. And then finally, you might be not working at home and your kids might have to be at home for school. So how do you answer the question of, is someone there to actually monitor my kids? So COVID-19 and 2020 has been extremely frustrating for everyone, right? Many of us are confined to home, not everyone. Some of us have to leave the home for work. Either we're faced with no learning, remote learning, or we have to deal with in-person learning, which is also kind of scary. We have to keep our children learning, but now they're not only on iPads or whatever devices, phones, etc., to be entertained, but they're also using them for learning. And then obviously you have your own working needs if you're a parent. So how do you balance all of this, right? And then you might have internet issues, right? Maybe you don't have a very good internet connection. Maybe you have device issues or you have a school issued device, right? It's not that easy to opt out of these things, especially when you're talking about privacy and security. Sometimes you may not have a choice and you might have to use a Chromebook or whatever your school has issued. So what we'd like to say to you is the first thing you can do is be mindful and engaged, right? It doesn't take a lot of effort. It's okay if you can't be there to monitor 24/7, whether that's because you're working at the same time in the home, whether that's because you're out of the home or so on. For privacy and security, the easiest thing you can do is to actually engage your children in conversations about things like screen time and privacy and security and what they're doing at school, right? And if you're not at home with them, just schedule a quick check-in time. Ask them about, what did you get up to today? Sometimes teachers summarize these and they might send out notices or sort of emails about what kids are doing. If you don't get that, you could always ask the teacher, what are the kids doing in school, and use that as a conversation starter. And this is really good for privacy and security because it gives you an idea about what they're actually using when they're online. You could ask about what sites they've gone onto, and then you could try to gauge if these are reputable or non-reputable sites. Now you might think again, how am I going to know that? I don't know all these sites. I don't know about all these apps, but you're not alone. There are many different resources that you can use. One of our favorite ones to recommend is one called Common Sense Media. So Common Sense Media reviews apps, websites, TV programs, and so on. And you can go on, search for an app name, and they'll give you some information about what age range the app is targeted for, what kinds of policies they have. They don't have a lot of information about the privacy policies often, but you can get some idea about whether something is reputable or not. They also have parent and kid reviews sometimes. And also they have privacy and security learning resources for parents to learn about what the issues are, for teachers to use in their classroom and so on. So I really recommend that one. There's also the Future of Privacy Forum. So they have a whole section on K through 12, and they talk all about the privacy and security issues around education. So if you're really interested, I would recommend that you read up on that forum. And then finally, there's the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They really are very interested in helping people with issues around student privacy. They kind of go more towards like just protecting students and so on, and less on sort of, what do teachers need and what do schools need. But they have a good section on, student privacy needs and surveillance and things like that. So that's another resource that you could use to kind of check up on what your kids are doing if you're really interested. Or even, like I said, even if at a basic level, you could just ask your kids what they're doing, that's already giving you some idea about what they're doing, where they're going, and gives you, an idea if there are any red flags. The next thing is managing screen time, right? So aside from privacy and security, kids are learning a lot. You might be sort of thinking, my kids are online all the time. What do I do? Well, focus on quality, not quantity, right? Sometimes they may have to be online if you have to get work done or something else, right? And so we advise take breaks where possible. Again, be aware of what sites your kids are going to. If you can at least curate what they're doing or have some awareness of that, that's a step in the right direction to helping maintain privacy and security and knowing if there are any issues that come up. And then set boundaries on what's okay and what's not okay. If you have those discussions up front, then you don't necessarily have to rely on a technology to manage those boundaries for you. But if that's something that you need for your family, then sure, consider that as well. And then finally, it's 2020. We've all felt overwhelmed. There's pressure to keep children learning. There's pressure to keep working. It is America after all, and we're all working all the time. but we say, do your best. It's all you can do, really. And so with privacy and security for kids right now, it's a tough situation. Cut yourself and your kids some slack. Again, do your best. It's all you can do. And then I just use this last moment to say, if you are interested in technology and policy, at UChicago, we have this great program. It's a master's in computational analysis and public policy. It's jointly run with our Department of Computer Science and also the Harris School of Public Policy. So I encourage you to look into that if you'd like to do this kind of research yourself, or even look into human-computer interaction research, and feel free to reach out to me. And then finally, I've talked to you about my colleagues, one of which is here today, one of whom is here today, but really it's, we're only able to do this kind of research because of all the students and other collaborators we have. I didn't get a picture of everyone up here, but these are some of the faces that are actually helping us undertake this research. And then we have, in full disclosure, some of our research has been funded by Google, and most recently we've been funded by the National Science Foundation. So we'd love to hear from you if you're interested in that. And that's it for me today. I thought we could move on to Q&A, and I just put some things that I thought you might want to discuss, like what are the challenges you are experiencing around these issues? What are the concerns you have? Are there experiences you'd like to share? And how are you balancing privacy and security for your kids during online learning? Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I think we definitely do have some questions, so we'll go ahead and start going through those, and I'll take the first one. So first question is by Dan Basil. So have you done any work with non-school mentoring and tutoring programs who are now doing mostly remote connections with kids? So I think there's a lot of tutoring that's going on.
Right.
So are those folks you've been talking to?
That's a good question. I also asked Tammy to unmute and also put on her video right now. So we've not done any research on how non-school environments that are still working with kids are dealing with this issue, but we are planning to work in sort of an after-school capacity with some of the learning. So our idea is, in order to gather data and even just to help kids with learning, especially in the pandemic, we will have to engage with sort of after-school programs and other kinds of outreach programs that do interact with kids. But I think they face a lot of the same issues, right? Where they're also trying to figure out, how do we connect safely with kids? They have to think about, like, should adults be allowed to even just live stream with kids on their own or not? School districts have very strict rules about that. Like Chicago Public Schools, you cannot do that unless there's a teacher present. So these are the kinds of issues you have to be thinking about. And then obviously, depending on what activities you have, things like making sure there's not just a one-on-one between one kid, but they're groups of kids. These are some of the things you can do to kind of manage some of those privacy and security concerns, but many of them I think are similar. So this is something that's an open area of research. Yeah. Tammy, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, hello everybody. It's great to be here tonight, and thanks Marshini for inviting me to tag along. So in some of my other research projects, we've done a lot of community work and in informal settings, and so one of the things that we've had to do has been to also pivot online for some of those projects as well. So we've done some virtual sessions online, and of course in the informal setting you don't have the same sort of clear regulations and guidelines that you may have in some school systems and things like that. And so a lot of times it becomes on the practitioners managing the informal programs to put some of those practices in place that Marshini was just talking about. And one of the things that you can do also is really leverage the sort of the face-to-face environment that you had, right? So going through your networks that are actually in the neighborhoods and communities that you already have been working with very closely, and sort of limiting participation to those spaces.
Want to take the next one, Sean?
Yeah. This one's from Carolyn. Asks, have you explored advising school districts, those who purchase ed tech products and hardware, on best practices regarding privacy for their students?
That's another great question. So actually, that's an ongoing area of research. So what we're planning to do, hopefully if it gets funded, is we want to actually take stock of what educational technology apps different school districts are actually using. And we're hoping to do an analysis of some of the privacy policies that they have. And then we'd be in a better position to actually make those kind of, or do the, fulfill that kind of advisory role. There are some organizations that have done this kind of analysis. And so again, I offhand, I can't think of the website, but some analysis has been done on this, but not at a really wide scale. So that's something that we're looking to do, because we're very interested in educational technologies and what are the pros of them for schools, like what data can they use to help them, and how can we also give parents and students protections while still giving schools the things that they need, right? So this is something we haven't done yet, but something we're planning to do. And Tammy, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I think so.
I can take the next one. This one's from Steve. So what impact do parents have on the ability of children to learn and stay safe? Is this a large factor that you found in your research, or are students oftentimes just able to overcome in-house support issues on their own?
I think it sort of depends on the child. So some of the kids that we spoke to, and Tammy, you can jump in anytime. Some of the kids we spoke to, they just had parents who allowed them to be online more, like even at age sort of 10 or 11. And so those kids tended to be a bit more savvy on their own, even though they didn't have as much input from parents. But I think, sometimes it can be hard. Like if you have a parent who does not know much about tech or isn't on the tech a lot, then there is this kind of, it's hard for them to fill a gap on their own, right? So I think parents can play a large role if they have that knowledge and if they can provide that scaffolding for kids. But even if that isn't there, like often kids are able to pick that up on their own or get support from school. So it's not just all or nothing, right? If the support is there, it's beneficial for the child. But if it isn't, it's not like the child cannot learn these kinds of concepts on their own. Tammy, did you?
Yeah, I guess I would say the new project that Marshini mentioned that we're working on is really emphasizing helping kids make these connections between and helping really the whole school community to make connections between home and school environments that the kids are in, so that there are things that the kids are learning at school and resources that they have to learn at school, and then there's things that they have at home and resources they have at home where they have a much more free-form environment, and so really helping them to connect those contexts. And as a matter of fact, that's what we call the project, is connecting context. So helping them to make those connections across home and school so they can leverage those resources.
Yeah. So just to build one more thing on what Tammy is saying, is the reason we want to connect the context is because then if a parent doesn't know about privacy and security, we can send home resources so that not just the child gets reinforced, like whatever they're learning at school, but the parent can also learn those concepts, right? So that's our idea, is if we have these micro lessons, teachers can integrate them into their classroom resources, but then we can also have the side effect of helping parents to learn about these very same issues.
And another question from Howard. Is it worth the effort to request a Nexus Lexis report to see if your child has an online consumer report?
I am not sure what a Nexus Lexis report is. So I'm afraid, I don't know, Tammy, if you know that, but
they're like one of the big data aggregation companies. So it's like, if you've bought something on some website somewhere, they probably have a file on you.
Oh, I see. I'm not sure. Like, I mean, I think that sort of gets into COPA and like what data might be collected on your kid if they're under a certain age. Obviously, if they're not under 13, it's sort of harder to know whether the data was collected with consent or not. I'd certainly say, there's no harm in requesting something like that, but as to what recourse you have if you find that there's a record on your kid, and knowing where that data came from, I think that might be harder to just figure out from the record itself, right? So then you have to go back and say, well, how did they get this data in the first place? And that's not that easy to answer from that on its own.
Yeah, I would also say too, like maybe there's also opportunities to think about ways that you can talk to your kids about some of these things. So like, let's say you do get the report and you see that there's these different technologies that are capturing data and things like that. Like that might be a sort of teachable moment for your child too, to say like, hey, well, when you use Google, they're collecting this this kind of information, and just having conversations about what the kids' preferences are and things like that, and helping them to know that they can set those preferences, that they should, and that should be an expectation that they have with their technology use.
Yeah, I could imagine that'd be an eye-opening experience. It's like Googling yourself for the first time. You're like, how did they get this, right? Like, it's wild.
I mean, one thing we also talked about was just how, again, this gets into the ages and like what you help kids learn at different ages. But like we have mentioned, like it's very hard for humans to see like long-term impacts. So sometimes even if you do that with a younger kid, say like, well, be careful what you post online because it'll be there when you're in college. Like that may not mean as much to like a 7 or 8-year-old. It might mean a bit more to like a teenager and so on. So again, that's part of our research, is to figure out, well, how do we help kids that are younger learn about some of these things so that they can manage these issues, even when they're not at like an age that it means a lot to them.
Right.
Yeah. And it may be like, maybe that could be, I mean, I'm sure there's some downsides to getting those kinds of reports because it might scare you and you might not know what to do, right, with that kind of information. But the good thing could be that you could get some really concrete examples to share with your child, because a lot of times this stuff is so abstract. So to say like, well, when you were playing Privacy Doodle Jump the other day, they were like looking at all the things you were, jumping on or something like that, right? Or collecting information about that could be a concrete thing to talk about.
Yeah. Or even just watching YouTube. And like, I think when we spoke with some of the kids in our studies, a lot of them, they knew that data was being tracked about them from seeing that YouTube recommended videos for them.
Right.
And so like something as simple as that could also be one of these moments Tammy's talking about, where you could use that as well, how do you think YouTube knows that?
Right.
How do they know what you like?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are other ways to sort of surface these issues and have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue into next question. So there's, I think we were actually talking about this last week. We actually at ChaiHackNight have a standing digital security breakout group. And so we were talking about this last week around like, what's the pitch that you give to adults on why this is important? Why is online security important? And it's oftentimes hard to make that case. I'm curious, and I think you just cited a couple of good examples or ways to like sort of broach that subject, but have you found, and I'm sure it varies on age for the kid, but like, have you found like a go-to like successful pitch to convince kids that this kind of stuff is important?
That's a tough one. I don't know. Tammy, do we have our go-to example? I guess like we like YouTube as a good example of like for data tracking and things like that. But I think passwords, like we've done a lot around passwords and like what people, or at least the kids have talked a lot about passwords and like how access to certain things, might let people know everything from the present list that you have for Christmas to where you keep your candy to, how much you weigh, etc. Right? Depending on the age of the kid. So I think we don't have a super go-to example. I think it just depends on, like I said, it has to be very contextualized to a particular set of kids. Like, Tammy, what was the soccer? No, it wasn't. It was a football player.
Oh, Eli.
Yes.
Eli man.
You want to tell a story about that kid?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we were trying to create. We were doing a co-design session with kids, and we were trying to create an app that, we had the kids actually create your own adventure story. So they had to like make a story, and it would have different implications depending on what privacy settings you chose. And so I worked with a young boy who a young elementary school age boy who loved the New York Giants. And so we talked when Eli Manning was still a Giant. And so we made this story about Eli Manning getting onto Instagram and the data that Instagram talking about. It's sort of like how Instagram knew information about him, and he had to make these decisions about like is it okay for Instagram to know or to look at my contacts and see who my friends are, right? Or what kinds of information do you want Instagram to find out? And so through writing that story, we were able to kind of talk about how some of these things may have benefits for you, but then they also have a cost in terms of what the system knows. Right. Was that what you were talking about, Marshini?
Yeah. And that's a really great example, because I guess to your question, Derek, it's pretty much has to be something that kid or that group of kids is interested in, right?
Yeah.
So maybe your family does a lot of video calling. That might be an example, right? Maybe they don't. Maybe your family relies on one person to like get all the news and stuff because you have device or internet issues, right? So you kind of have to tailor it for a group of kids or some sort of context, because that's kind of what we found is the key. Is if it's relatable to the child, then they can see, how does this apply to my life? So it's either like, oh, here's my idol, and like this is something that's really cool that I'm passionate about, or it's something like, oh yeah, that happens to me. Like that happens when I watch YouTube. Right. Or yeah, that happens when I call grandma. So like that's kind of how you can really hit it home, or at least that's what we've learned.
I think too, like, so Marshini has always been a privacy and security person, but I have come into privacy and security because of Marshini. And so I think one of the questions, or the question you were asking was, how do you get parents to see the importance of it? And so I think for me, just personally, sometimes it's good to show adults examples with other adults. One thing, one researcher at the University of Maryland who does a really good job of getting people to really see like, some real concrete stories and making you go, wow, is Jen Goldbeck. And she talks about how there was a story where there was a guy who was frustrated because his teenage daughter kept getting these ads for baby supplies from Target. And he was like, why are you sending my daughter these, these baby ads and that kind of thing? And then a couple of weeks later, he found out that his daughter was pregnant. The Target knew it before he did, because it turns out that there was this sort of complex array of things that people buy, when they're pregnant that don't make logical sense, but it's just, what they do. And Target was able to piece that together before the dad was. And so examples like that really make it hit home, for you that, wow, like, things you wouldn't expect, they're able to decipher.
I remember that story. That was like almost 10 years ago. And like, think what they can do now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing too, that a lot of times we don't have to make so many of these cases for people right now, especially now that everybody's and they're running into all these privacy situations and different things like that. One of the elementary school teachers told us that she's seen kids' parents run in the background with their towel on, or just different things like that.
Yeah.
So they know.
Right. I think we have time for one more. You want to take the next one, Sean?
Yeah, I think just a kind of a simpler one, a more presently focused one. Like, how much more attention do you think is being paid to this now, given that we're in the pandemic in a very remote world, compared to before? And then also thinking about like, is there sort of like an impetus during this time right now to really start to like move the ball, so to speak, on some of this stuff, because everyone's so used to this remote world?
Right. So, I mean, I think that this was always an issue even before the pandemic. That's why we were studying it before the pandemic. So we didn't just come into this and decide, oh, this is a hot topic, let's jump on this. We've been doing it for a while because, like I mentioned, educational technologies are just being used more and more at schools, even before remote learning. So I definitely think that this was an issue before. It's going to continue to be an issue, even if we get back to in-person learning in the foreseeable future. Or when we get back to in-person learning in the foreseeable future. I think, yes, this probably is the time where the needle can be pushed a bit more, because the remote learning does, it ups the ante on some of these privacy and security issues, like we saw with the CPS example, right? And if you just Google in the news, there are tons of examples from every single state about this issue, right? The webcam issue isn't new. Actually, there was a case in Philadelphia several years ago where teachers were able to log in and turn on people's webcams on student school issued laptops, right? So there was a huge case about that. And so this isn't new. It's something that's worse now, and it will continue this way even if we have hybrid or in-person learning again, because educational technologies are not going away. Even if you're not on Zoom, you may still be using things like Seesaw or Remind or GoGuardian, Land School, all of these kinds of things in the classroom, right? So yes, I think it is an issue. I think it is very important, for example, to show how important districts think it is. Both the district we're working with in Maryland, Prince George's County Schools District, as well as Chicago Public Schools District, even though they're not doing research in many different areas, they did approve that we could go ahead with that research because they feel that it's very important and aligned with their strategic initiatives. So I do think that now's the time to get the needle pushed. I don't know how far you can push it, but I definitely think it's a good time to be studying this.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. So I just want to say thank you, Marshini and Tammy, again for joining us tonight. This is a great conversation. For everyone still watching, we're going to be switching over to our post live stream Zoom call. We'll put the link up there. Here it is. It's bit.ly/CHN remote Zoom. We'll drop that in the live chat as well. And we'll see everyone over there. But thanks again. And as we always like to say at the end of these things, go forth and hack.
Go forth and hack.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.